Before we go into our interview today, I wanted to let everyone know we have a new sponsor for our Energy Question podcast, the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, or USOGA for short. First established in 1917, USOGA has been an effective and creative voice for the industry for more than a century now. USOGA is dedicated to educating the public, policymakers, and legislators at the federal, state, and local levels about the value of the domestic oil and natural gas industry. If you're in the industry and not currently a USOGA member, please consider joining the association as a way of helping it tell your story to the policymakers whose actions impact everything you do each and every day. You can start that process by contacting USOGA through its website, usoga.org. Thanks so much to USOGA for sponsoring the Energy Question podcast. And now on with our show.
Hey, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. I'm your host, David Blackmon, and my special guest today is Doug Robison, an old friend who is the founder and CEO of Natura Resources, a company that is developing the first molten salt nuclear reactor here in the state of Texas. And Doug, how you doing today?
I'm good, David.
Well, listen, man, you've got a fascinating project going on out there in West Texas at Abilene Christian, and in conjunction with 4 different universities, research project. And I wanted, before we get into the Q&A about what you're doing, I want to give you a chance to tell our audience about your background and how you came to create Natura Resources. Am I pronouncing it correctly? I think I am.
Yeah, you got it. I'll run it through pretty quickly. So I'm third generation oil, David, in Texas. 40 years in the industry, in the oil and gas industry. Started in 1982. A real briefly how I transitioned from oil and gas to nuclear. In 2004, Governor Perry appointed me to the Texas Energy Planning Council, and I co-chaired the Energy Supply Committee with then Land Commissioner Jerry Patterson. And our mandate from the governor's office was, but the basic question is, how do you maximize energy production in Texas? And so we held hearings for a full year, then submitted a report to the governor's office for whatever legislative action Governor Perry wanted to take. One of our findings in 2004, and it was a hypothetical at that time, was if you were to replace hydrocarbons for power, particularly baseload power, and let's say hydrocarbons, primarily coal and natural gas, the only technology that can do that was nuclear. You know, fast forward, you know, my company EXL Petroleum went on to have a leading role in the development of the shale play in the Permian Basin, and that's a whole nother discussion. So 2017, I'm kind of looking at retirement. We're have been in Midland for 35 years, kind of the heart of the Permian there. And came to Abilene. Both our kids went through undergrad at Abilene Christian. I'm sitting I'm a supporter of ACU here in Abilene, and sitting in a meeting where Dr. Rusty Tao, who leads the NEXT lab, and that's Nuclear Engineering Experimental and Testing Lab, and they're doing this research on molten salt reactor. Well, as I'm sitting in the back of the room, I'm literally thinking back to 2004. There is a climate agenda now. We are removing hydrocarbons from the grid, coal, natural gas, and we're trying to replace it. And that's difficult. Plus, there's an aspect of the molten salt technology we'll talk about here in a second, I'm sure, that to meet some of the world's basic needs for lifting people out of poverty with affordable energy, providing safe drinking water, they're able to produce medical isotopes that are used in medical diagnostics and even curing cancer. So I met Dr. Tal in the back of the room, and I said, if you're fully funded, what could you do? He wasn't ready for that answer, so we got together 2 weeks later. He gave me an answer, and I said, you're funded, let's go. And so that was a $3.2 million gift out of my foundation. It was not an investment. That led to the Department of Energy. Now, Governor Perry is now Secretary of Energy Perry.
Yeah.
He sends his top staff down to Abilene. He heard about what we're doing. They fly us to DC, and the comment this is January of 2019 at this point. They said, you have to build this reactor. The U.S. has to lead the world in this technology. Would you guys take that on? and walked out of the room saying, okay, I guess we're going to build a reactor. And that's when I stood Natura Resources up. We have $30.5 million of research grants with the University of Texas at Austin, Texas A&M University, Georgia Institute of Technology, and Abilene Christian University. And that's how I got to answer your question without getting into the full story. That's how Natura came to be. I survived retirement for about 8 months.
Yeah.
And I thought the world of oil and gas was exciting, which it is. The world of nuclear, particularly advanced nuclear, is just as, if not even more exciting and unpredictable. So,
well, you mentioned Governor Perry's so interesting. He reached out to me out of the blue about a month ago. He had read a piece I'd written in the Daily Caller, and I ended up interviewing on this podcast. And during our interview, he said, "Listen, you've got to talk to Doug Robison about what's going on out in Abilene." And so that's what generated this episode of the podcast. But so most of our audience is not going to be familiar with this project. So talk about what exactly is a molten salt reactor, first of all.
Well, let me run through it. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a nuclear engineer or any of those. So I've got a lot of PhD. We have 150 working on the project.
Yeah.
60 PhDs. So if you want to have more expert podcasts, I can line them up for you, David. Very simply, molten salt reactors. First of all, it's a proven technology. They built a molten salt reactor at Oak Ridge in the 1960s. It ran for 5 years. There's two fundamental technology differences between what we normally think of a nuclear reactor. And we think of a nuclear reactor, those are light water reactors. And what that means is that you have a fuel rod. So you have the uranium, if you will, the fuel inside of a fuel rod, and that is lowered into a pool of water. That water is your coolant. It cools the reactor, and it also transfers the heat. All a reactor does basically is generate heat that you move from the reactor core through a heat exchange system to where you create steam, you turn a turbine, and you create electricity. That's kind of what they do. It's pretty simple from that viewpoint. They use water to do that. Molten salt reactors don't use water, they use molten salt. So molten salt is your coolant, your heat transfer fluid. The advantage is, from a safety standpoint, people's concerns about nuclear energy are usually that they're concerned about an accidental release and they're concerned about waste. The molten salt part of it handles the safety issue. Water is a good heat transfer fluid, but it flashes to steam at a relatively very low temperature.
Right.
And when it goes to steam, it goes to high pressure. And so you have high pressure reactors. And you're very limited in how high you can get that pressure. You just can't contain it. And so if you think of Fukushima, that wasn't a nuclear explosion, that was a chemical explosion. It's basically a release of that high pressure steam.
Yeah.
And molten salt, it melts at very high temperatures. So it acts like a liquid. Think of candle wax as maybe a good analogy. So you get it, this molten salt we're going to be using in the reactor has a melting temperature of 450 degrees Celsius, which is twice the operating temperature of a light water reactor. It cannot flash to a steam. The point of when it phase changes to a gas, the temperature is higher than the melting point of the steel of the reactor itself. And so it never can flash to steam. It never gets beyond being a liquid. And the other thing that happens, if you ever have a leak, if you have a valve or a discharge, as soon as that molten salt leaves the reactor vessel and falls below 450 degrees Celsius, it's going to turn back into a solid. Again, and so the containment at Oak Ridge,
it self-contains basically.
It's self-contained, At Oak Ridge, when they were in the 60s, when they built the MSRE, the molten salt research experiment, they were asked and answered facetiously but correctly, said, "What's your containment system?" They said, you dig a hole and you put a rock on top of it. I mean, that's not what they did. You have a containment system, but you never get into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
The other technology change is, I mentioned the solid fuel rod. So under light water reactors, you put the fuel inside that fuel rod. That's your primary containment. As fission is occurring, that fuel rod is degrading. When that fuel rod gets to the point of degradation where it is no longer safe containment, then you pull the fuel rod, and what is inside the fuel rod is still that fuel, and that now becomes waste or spent fuel rods. That happens when you have only burned 3 to 5% of the fuel in that fuel rod.
Wow.
And so you're putting 95 to 97% of perfectly good fuel. Now you have a 100,000-year storage problem because you have these fuel rods still full of fuel, and what are you going to do with them? And that's the waste issue. In a molten salt liquid fueled reactor, the fuel is in the salt. So think of mixing sugar into your coffee. The result of that is that we can practically burn 100% of the fuel, which means we generate no waste. And you don't have that storage problem that you have with our current technology. In fact, molten salt reactors can take those spent nuclear fuel rods that are currently sitting in storage around the country, trying to figure out what we're going to do with them for the next 100,000 years. We can take those fuel rods and use that 95 to 97% of fuel that's still in there as fuel for a molten salt reactor. So you answer those two concerns of waste and safety with the molten salt technology. That was proven in the 60s, and China has just deployed a molten salt reactor. So it's not theoretical. It's not, there's no unknown or yet to be proven technological problems. Our greatest mission is to show that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission can license an advanced reactor. They have never licensed an advanced reactor in the history of the NRC. All they have licensed is light water reactors. So it's not a technological problem, it's a licensing. You have to prove licensure, and you have to demonstrate that you've been able to do that.
Well, and of course we're not talking about what you're doing out there in Abilene. It's not going to be some massive, huge nuclear power plant, right? I mean, this is going to be we see a lot of news about modular reactors,
right,
being the future for nuclear energy. And what you're doing with what maybe 300, 500 megawatt capacity that can be located near demand centers, near population centers to cut down on transmission issues. And that's really the size of what you're doing out there right now, right?
The reactor. So what we're deploying at the first deployment of a molten salt reactor by Natura will be deployed at Abilene Christian University on campus in the facility. I'm actually sitting in one of the rooms right now of the Science Engineering Research Center that had our grand opening this last weekend. So ACU has built and completed the country's first advanced reactor facility. And what's notable in that, David, is that you don't have the huge containment domes because, again, you don't have the possibility of going to steam or going to a gas. And so if I were to carry this camera over to a window, we could look down into what is the trench. So it's what are the dimensions? It's 30 feet deep, 80 feet long, and 15 feet wide.
A very small footprint,
that is surrounded by 4-foot thick reinforced concrete, and that's it. And ACU built that. That's the first one they built, believe it or not, and they did it in less than a year. It's that simple to do. and that's all the containment you need for a molten salt reactor. And of course, the reactor itself, if you can envision a Russian nested doll, has multiple of containments. So this reactor we're deploying at ACU is a research reactor, and one of its purposes is to conduct research and education at ACU and the other participating universities. The core is the size of your refrigerator. I mean, it's 6 foot tall and 4 foot wide. It's not very big. And the reactor vessel itself will fit on the back of a semi. In fact, one of the things we're demonstrating on this reactor is this reactor will be fabricated somewhere else and brought into Abilene on the back of a semi. In fact, maybe the most impressive part of this research bay is the 40-ton crane. And that crane is merely there to pick up the reactor and lower it down into the research bay. Now, I want everyone to understand there is not fuel in the reactor when it's rolling down the highway. It's an empty metal vessel. It's not a radioactive. It doesn't have fuel as it's going down the highway. That gets added when the reactor is installed in the research bay. And so the reactors, the commercial reactors that we will be deploying, are all designed to fit on the back of semis. I mean, we have specifically engineered according to what can be done that, and the advantage is what you just mentioned. It's a classification of small modular reactors.
Yeah.
What it allows is central manufacturing, and you can build reactors at a manufacturing facility, assembly line, and then take them and place them wherever you need them. And our ability to deploy reactors quickly and economically and get the levelized cost of electricity down to a point to where it's competitive. Again, going back to the mission statement, if we're not providing power or electricity that's affordable, then we're really not meeting people's needs. And so one of the advantages of mass production, obviously, is your economies of scale are greatly reduced. And so this first reactor will be a demonstration of remote manufacturing and installation.
Just as an aside, the transmission piece of this transition that we have underway is such a huge prohibitive factor right now for wind and solar, because particularly wind, because you have to build these wind farms away from population centers, out where the wind blows in an open space. And then you have miles and miles of transmission. The DOE itself estimates we're going to have to build 47,000 new miles of high voltage transmission between now and 2032. Well, that's something that's never remotely been accomplished before. And getting these transmission lines permitted is a big, hairy deal that takes a lot of time and investment. And so when you can site these modular reactors in population centers and with no fear of, killing anybody, it becomes a huge factor to facilitate this transition to zero emission. This is a zero emission unit, right?
Oh yeah, well, nuclear is, and even our current nuclear light water reactors are by far the safest energy we have. There's no doubt about it. If you look at the safety record of nuclear, and if you even go back and examine the accidents, and I'm going to take Chernobyl and put that off to the side because that was a failed design.
Right.
But the safety record of nuclear, it far surpasses any other sort of power we have, including renewables. And we move energy right now. We move energy one of two ways. We either move energy through electrons over transmission lines, or we move molecules through pipelines. So either we're pumping electricity across transmission lines, and look at what happens as we move power via transmission lines across, not just mentioning the expense and the impossibility of building that transmission that you just talked about, is how many times have we heard of wildfires, not to mention what just happened in Lahaina due to down transmission lines.
Right.
Well, and we hear every year of down transmission lines in California.
California, yeah.
If you can put the power in the vicinity of where you need it and scale it to fit that need, then you don't have to transport those molecules across all that space. And on the other part of it is we transmit power via electrons, molecules, as we transport either by rail or by pipeline. And David, my analogy is we don't shop at one giant supermarket down near Brady, Texas, which is supposedly the heart of Texas, right? We have our food in neighborhood stores. We distribute everything except power.
Right.
And we have to, as you mentioned, centrally manufacture power. Either it's at a wind farm because that's where the wind is, and unfortunately, most of the wind exists in places where people do not, or it's at refineries, or you're producing oil and gas, oil and natural gas, where those formations exist. And oftentimes that is not where people live. And so advanced nuclear small modular reactor allows you to put the power, scale it to where you need it. So what you need for putting a reactor, for example, at Corpus Christi, Texas, is going to be different than what you need to scale to provide power in Houston, Texas, or so forth. And then you also look at behind the grid, where you're providing power to manufacturing facilities, to refineries, to data centers that need massive amounts of power, but they need massive amounts of reliable power. So they can't rely on the wind and the sun. They need it 24/7, 365. And they don't want to be burning power off of the grid that's coming from primarily hydrocarbons. And so nuclear, particularly molten salt reactors, are where you can marry a reactor dedicated to a manufacturing facility, to a refinery, to a oil field, to a data processing center, whatever the case may be. So you provide dedicated, clean, zero emission power to those facilities. And then that's not even talking about deploying a reactor at a medical facility. Again, now that would be in the space of a microreactor.
Right.
Because it's a liquid fueled reactor, we can harvest radioisotopes, and what can be done with that medically is almost beyond belief.
Pretty amazing. Yeah.
We've only touched the hem of the garment on that technology.
Yeah. Back to the reactor at ACU, are you going to be able to actually provide electricity in the course of the research to the university or to the surrounding community? Or
No,
does that have to wait until it's licensed?
No, yeah, well, where we are in the licensing process, we are only one of two projects that have actually filed a construction permit and been docketed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So there's a number of initiatives out there, but very few have actually got to that point. We will, when this reactor goes critical, it is classified by the Department of Energy as a research reactor. As such, it cannot connect to the grid under current regulations. So the heat that will come off that reactor will be vented. So it's not going to be utilized for the generation of, it could be, but it's currently not going to be utilized for the generation of electricity. What we're demonstrating with that reactor, we're demonstrating licensure, as I mentioned earlier, and then that reactor becomes very important for gathering data as to how molten salt reactors happen. A lot of chemical analysis is happening with that, and that feeds into the commercial reactors that we're already designing and preparing to deploy. Now, later reactors, absolutely commercial reactors will be hooked to the grid. This reactor is for research and education. It's for demonstrating licensure and for gathering data for commercial deployment to follow.
So you're on a pretty aggressive timeline here, right? I mean, when is the reactor currently scheduled to go critical?
So I bring an oil and gas mentality to this, and you can relate to that. I don't know if all of your viewers can. So we have a saying in the oil and gas patch about turning to the right. That means you're drilling, is what that means. And if you're not drilling, you're not doing anything. You're not producing. So I brought that mentality to this project: is how do we get to production as fast as possible? And so we chose the research reactor route, engagement with the NRC, which has been excellent, engagement with the Department of Energy, which has been excellent. And we have done in months what others have failed to do in years. So we have a definite missional, and it goes back to the basic mission. If we're trying to meet some of the world's basic needs, how long do we want to wait to do that? We want to do that. And so this, now for an oil and gas guy, to say that the reactor is going to go critical in late 2025, 2026, to me, that's forever. In the nuclear world, that's moving at very, very fast speed.
Yeah.
So I've had to adjust my way of thinking as far as how quickly things happen. I understand how complicated the process is, particularly for doing something that's never been done before, in the sense of the NRC has never licensed a molten salt reactor. The molten salt reactor in the 60s, that was before the NRC existed. So they've never done this. And so this is an education process, and they're actively engaged and really diving into it deeply, because I think there's acknowledgement that advanced nuclear is the thing. That's where we're going. That's where we've got to go. If we're going to have a climate agenda and we don't want to sit in the dark and freeze to death, we have to have nuclear. It's a pretty simple equation. And so, I think everybody feels the pressure to get there sooner. Congress has passed several bills. And it moves from administration to administration. It's bipartisan, which is good to see. And so the challenge is going to be, how does the federal government respond? But then there's also another opportunity. How do states respond? And we have 20 different states now that have passed or are passing legislation pro advanced nuclear legislation. A number of states have held their hands up and said, we want to be the leading state for advanced nuclear in the country. Governor Abbott issued an initiative a few weeks ago on studying the future of nuclear in Texas. I think that is Texas holding its hand up to say we want to be the leader. And I would argue that there's few states, if any, that have the energy history that Texas does.
Oh,
and so I'm excited to see what happens with that work that PUC Commissioner Gladfeldy will be heading that effort. And so that's going to be really interesting to follow that here in the next year to 18 months as that work moves forward.
Yeah, Texas, I mean, there's no reason why Texas shouldn't be a leader in this. I mean, we've been the leader in wind development. We're the fastest developing solar state in the country right now. We'll have the biggest suite of solar powered energy in 2 years, I think, of any state. And there's no reason why Texas shouldn't lead on nuclear. And Governor Perry deserves an awful lot of the credit for that, right? I mean, most of this germinated up during his administration, and Governor Abbott has also made sure the state remains a leader. So I think, if you're going to do this project, you're probably in the best place you can be, right?
I would agree. The thing that I keep remembering in my mind, though, David, is we are pulling power off of the grid faster than we're replacing it. And I'm saying I'm speaking not just as a state, but as a country, even across the world.
Yeah,
is we are losing the battle, and we are going to put ourselves into an energy where we don't have enough energy to meet our supply, and that sounds like, on the surface level, it sounds like, well, we'll have to conserve or what. No, if you don't have enough energy, if the lights go out, things get very serious. We had an event in Texas in February of 2021, a weather event, and where we lost power, and we had 600 to 700 Texans die just in those 3 days. You can't go without power. Right. And I think we're so used to it that we can't even imagine what it's like to be without power for a sustained period of time, because we really have never experienced that except in extreme disaster situations. And we have to avoid them. We can't let that happen.
Yeah, we barely eat by this summer, and I'm really concerned about the winter because we don't have enough thermal capacity right now. Don't have enough nuclear. And boy, if you have another big winter event like Uri, ERCOT's really gonna have to work some magic. So this is man, I can't tell you how great it is seeing you again. I hope someday soon we'll be able to meet up in person. And I would love to come tour that facility.
Invitation's open. Just let me know.
All right, man. Thank you so much. We're out of time. I'm going to have to wrap this up. But folks, this is an important project we have going out there in West Texas. Pay attention to the news around it. It's going to be a big deal for our state and our country. And we're very lucky to have old oil guys like Doug Robison leading the project. Anyway, that's all for the energy question this time. Thank you for U.S. Oil and Gas Association for being our sponsor. Thanks to the Sandstone Group for producing and hosting the podcast, and to our extraordinary producer, Eric Burrell. I'm David Blackmon. That's all for now.